But let me introduce Eric Schwartz. He's co-founder of Farm Bud Cooperative, and he's an entrepreneur and legislation activist. You know what? I have to do this. There's one reason why I'm interested in cannabis. As I get older, I have all of these things that don't work as well as they used to. And so, okay. He's a legislative activist advocating for policies in the cannabis space that benefit Massachusetts farmers and craft cultivators, as well as communities disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. And I'm going to ask him to explain that at some point today. Okay, Farm Bud Co-op is working to better local communities through cannabis education and cultural enrichment, while also advocating for the development of organic cultivation standards in the state of Massachusetts. Originally from Rochester, New York, Eric went to college in Worcester, Mass., and he obtained a liberal arts degree in sociology and creative writing. He has 10 years of marketing experience in the scholarly publishing industry. He utilizes his marketing skills as an activist and community organizer. Eric lives in Somerville, Massachusetts with his wife and 2 daughters. In this presentation, he'll go over some of the history as well as politics of the cannabis plant, from the emergence of cannabis in agrarian and colonial societies to the legalization of cannabis in the state of Massachusetts. He will describe his personal education with the plant as an advocate, a patient, and a consumer. He will also share his experience with home growing cannabis and give a brief tutorial on how to grow in a living soil. Okay.
Great.
Eric,
Thank
it's all
you.
yours.
We'll need to turn the lights down. Yeah, just to make sure. Yeah, so I'm Eric Schwartz. Thank you for that introduction, Sue, and thank you for obviously inviting me here. Sue had said on a couple of occasions that Lancaster was, at least in her words, conservative, and I said, great, I want to go somewhere that's conservative and talk about cannabis and talk about the politics of cannabis. So as we sort of came up with this, my immersion is certainly on the political side as an activist, as an advocate, but I also developed into a home grower, so that'll be part of the discussion as well. We did want to have a cultivator here. Unfortunately, she had a prior engagement and then she came down with pneumonia. So not here currently, but in discussion with Sue, perhaps in the future we can delve into the cultivation a little more deeply. So I guess 2 quick just things. First off, 1, I'm not a lawyer, just letting everyone know that, not a lawyer. Very much an activist and advocate, but I'm not a lawyer. And 2, I'm not necessarily a cultivation expert. You know, there's people that have been growing cannabis in the underground, quite frankly, for decades. I've only been growing it for about a year or so at home. So, but I definitely will do the best I can to do that tutorial part at the end. I also have Sean Thackeray, who's our intern here. When I kind of introduce myself in the first slide, I'm going to have Sean come up real quick. It was very nice of him to join us tonight. So who am I? My name's Eric Schwartz, as Sue said, co-founder of Farm Bud Cooperative. I do have a day job, but in the cannabis industry, you always have a side hustle, so this is sort of my side hustle at the moment. But I really see sort of myself as 3 things. 1, I'm a father, father of 2 girls. Nora's 6 months now, Lucy is 3. That's Lucy there on the left. I'm an advocate. I testified first in front of the Joint Committee on Marijuana Policy that was formed between the House and the Senate at the State House. They were basically, I'll get into this a little bit further, but they were reworking Question 4 after Question 4 was passed in 2016. Testified in front of that committee of the State House. Testified 5 times in front of the Cannabis Control Commission before the regulations were finalized. That's me in Boston. That's Chairman Hoffman there, Commissioner Doyle, and Commissioner McBride. Kind of an intimate setting there. In addition to being an advocate, I'm really an entrepreneur. Now, admittedly, I'm a little new to being an entrepreneur. Sort of an entrepreneur basically since the passage of Question 4, but it's been a really exciting experience for me, quite honestly, to be able to kind of I don't know, kind of explore, really what I'm interested in, but, develop that into a living, breathing business model has really been just a really interesting journey. And Sean, you want to come up real quick? Just a quick introduction.
I'm the social media intern, and again, you don't need to worry, I won't be taking photos of you. But much like you, I also have a side hustle. I'm a student, I'm a senior in college. My degree is in biology with a concentration in botany, and my area of interest is designing ecologically minded agriculture systems. So I first met Eric and learned of farm bug last year at the Northeast Organic Farmers Association meeting in Worcester, and I was just captivated because everywhere I look, I want to apply my degree in the cannabis field, and it's a new fledgling field, and everywhere you look, there are these massive industrial facilities that don't care about the communities that they're in, and they don't care about the farming practices they're using. And Farm Bug stood out to me because it's a small-scale craft cannabis operation that I want to be sustainable. I want to pursue my dream, make a product that I care about, but in a way that won't harm my community, in a way that won't harm the environment. And so I've been working, doing the social media, doing the Facebook posts, doing photos for the past year, and it's been really, really awesome to see how the co-op has grown and watch how advocacy works in real time.
Great. Thanks, Sean. It's like a excellent commercial there. All right, so how did I get here? One, the plant, right? And that is a shot of my current indica dominant that I'm growing now. Two, an idea, sort of start my own business. And three, red tape. There is a lot of bureaucracy related to the legalization of a plant that's been under prohibition for decades and decades and decades. And honestly, as a small player, as an entrepreneur, the interesting thing about cannabis that quite honestly is maybe a little bit different than other businesses that are out there is you have million-dollar companies sort of coming in from out of state that have lots and lots of financial backing. It's a very lucrative industry, and to be sort of a, I guess, whatever you want to call me, a small business entrepreneur, small local guy, however you want to look at me, you really have to advocate for yourself. And so, sorry, my clicker here. Sorry. Might have to go from here. My apologies, sorry. There we go. My bad. We're up and running again. So you really have to advocate for yourself. This is me advocating in Worcester. And this was quoted in the Worcester Gazette. There's no ganja like farm-grown ganja, says Eric, co-founder of Farm Bug Co-op. I think Massachusetts can be a shining example for the rest of the country in ending the failed marijuana policy. It's sort of really getting the vision out there, I think, when you're kind of, advocating, again, sort of for yourself, for your vision, and really trying to advocate for the industry that I want to see develop here in Massachusetts. And so, yeah, that was me in Worcester maybe, I don't know, a year or so ago at this point. That was, trying to think exactly, that was, I think, before draft regs, I think that was before draft regs were out. The initial time when the Cannabis Control Commission basically went across the state, and Worcester was one of the areas where they went to. All right, so what I'm going to get into now is the politics of cannabis. It's a deep, ingrained in basically our history and, society, essentially. Just some quick things here. That's Haile Selassie. I am interested in Rastafarian a little bit. I don't know if anyone in the audience is at all. That's Leonard Powell, who's supposedly the first Rastafarian. Obviously we have Nixon, the war on the Vietnam War, which very much connected to the war on drugs, so to speak. Peter Tosh, actually one of my big sort of musicians who I like very much, and interesting enough, through my advocacy, I've actually gotten in touch with Peter Tosh's daughter, who actually lives here in Massachusetts, and have actually developed a really good friendship with her. So for me, this slide really shows the different sides of cannabis, right? So you have essentially a crop that's grown in two different ways. It's called hemp. It's all cannabis, so hemp is cannabis as well, but it's grown in two different ways, generally for two different reasons. So you have this sort of one aspect of it, which is this native, spiritualism, and that way of growing the plant is essentially to achieve an altered state of consciousness, and that's where the psychotropic effects of the plant come into play. The interesting thing for me is you also have hemp, which is known for sort of its industrial toughness, its commercial production, which also is essentially attached to colonialism. And I'll go into this a little bit more, but you kind of have this dichotomy really between sort of native spiritual cultures and colonialism or imperialism, and as the plant sort of proliferates across society. So that's kind of what I'm getting into here. Seeds for sales. So most of the sales, if not all, I think that I'm aware of, in colonialism, as far as traveling to the Americas and across the globe, so to speak, were made of hemp. So you have this kind of historical progress where humans shift from hunter-gatherers to agrarian societies. Agrarian societies grow the cannabis plant. Colonial society uses the plant to advance colonial rule, literally on the boats, in the sales. The plant proliferates throughout people, places, and cultures, and basically the plant follows humans where they go. I mean, now the plant has been here for, before humans, basically, but it's kind of, to me, interesting how the plant has sort of followed us, throughout society and the cultures that we've developed. So these are by no means like all of the cultures that have used cannabis, but I'm just kind of, give a very quick, run through of some cultures that have used it. This, to the best of my knowledge, it can't be proven, but some people believe that ancient Chinese may have been the first. But the really interesting thing about cannabis is you have cultures that develop cannabis, and then immediately, either after the development of cannabis or whatever it may be, you also have those same cultures prohibiting it. So in China, you have the Chinese developing the plant, but then you have Taoism that comes in 600 BC that rejects intoxicants. So then you have a process of prohibition. A lot of Muslim societies have been known to use cannabis, but then you also have Muhammad that's prohibiting its use. Mystic Sufis, another Muslim group that used cannabis for, again, its sort of spiritual nature in terms of spiritual religion nature. And then you have the Egyptian government that are raiding cannabis farms in 1324. And then you have the Pope. Obviously, Christians don't really like the Muslims so much, and Pope Innocent, I guess that's the 8th, bans in 1484. And yes, his name is Pope Innocent. I thought that was kind of interesting when I was looking that up. So the emergence of prohibition in the Americas. Now, this is where the term marijuana comes from, which, quite frankly, is sort of a racist term for referring to those folks that use the plant. So specifically related to the Americas, it's tied to the Spanish introducing hemp into America. Again, you have societies in Europe coming over to the Americas, bringing the hemp plant. Mexico is, as we all know, hot, dry climate, very, very good for cannabis growing. So it proliferates, through that culture. Mexican peasants grow and smoke cannabis. Then you have a period where Mexico's politics and economy are in peril under a dictatorship, and many Mexicans migrate from the U.S. Around the time of the Mexican Revolution in 1910, seeking better economic opportunities. Mexican laborers, that come, into America, are known for smoking cannabis. I don't know if you can see it too well, but that's some sort of propaganda on the bottom there. It says "Mystery of the Strange Mexican Weed." And so migrant laborers are vilified by white Americans for looking different and working for lower wages, and that's where that connection kind of comes into play with marijuana, and thus the term that we've sort of developed here in the States. So the nature of prohibition. I hope you don't mind if I sort of have a little bit of water throughout. The nature of prohibition, for me, it comes down to two things. You have a ruling class that really is controlling other classes through the process of prohibition. Traditionally, anytime prohibition comes into play throughout history, if you look at it, it always comes from the ruling class, and it's always a method of essentially controlling. Hope I didn't. Oh, I think this is trying to connect to the internet. I apologize. I don't know why it's doing that. So cannabis prohibition in the U.S. This is kind of a fascinating topic to me. And I know we're not sort of doing an interactive thing or whatever, but maybe by a raise of hands, does anyone know who this here is the picture of? We got one person. No? A couple? This is Harry Anslinger. Very interesting story, at least, from my perspective as far as, I'm sorry? An L?
He's in hell.
Oh, he's in hell. Hopefully he's in hell, yes. Thank you for that. So it's really an interesting cultural story, though, Harry Anslinger. And I'll just kind of give you sort of a brief rundown of what was going on at the time. But he's the first commissioner of the U.S. Federal Bureau of Narcotics. But it's interesting, what was happening was you have alcohol prohibition, which lasted from 1920 to 1933. That was the 18th Amendment that came into play in terms of, prohibiting, prohibition of alcohol in the United States. Prior, which is very, very interesting here, prior to the end of alcohol prohibition, Anslinger claims cannabis poses no issue. However, now that you have alcohol legal again, the Department of Prohibition essentially ceases to exist after the 21st Amendment is passed. So what Harry Anslinger is essentially doing is looking for another way, I guess you could say, to make money, or another way, another job, basically, he needs. And what he does is, in the 1930s, around 1930, he focuses on marijuana. So he shifts from, alcohol. Obviously, alcohol, when it's in prohibition, he did actually have some success in against the mob during the times of prohibition, but like I said, alcohol is then legalized again, and Harry needs to concentrate on something else, so he moves on to cannabis. And in particular, in the 1930s, he begins targeting the black jazz community. And so the story of Billie Holiday is a really sad one. And this is a historical fact, again, that is very kind of profound for me. As Billie Holiday lay in a hospital bed suffering from liver and heart disease, and she did struggle with alcoholism, she was arrested and handcuffed in her hospital bed by the officers from the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, headed by Harry Anslinger. This is someone that's literally dying in the hospital, and you have the Federal Bureau there, essentially arresting her in her hospital bed. And just kind of, to sort of really hit the point home, it's really a form of racial supremacy. And this is a quote from Harry Anslinger: reefer makes darkies think they're as good as white men. So, again, it's unfortunately that form of, again, a ruling class sort of controlling a non-ruling class. Very interesting one here for me. I did a book a bit ago where I learned about this, but you have Billie Holiday on the left there. You have Senator Joseph McCarthy, McCarthyism, Red Scare, all that, on the right there. What you probably don't know historically is, yes, Billie Holiday was, struggled with addiction and morphine and, heroin, but Senator Joseph McCarthy, around the same time, also was addicted to morphine. So you have one individual who's being handcuffed to a hospital bed. I don't know if she was actually handcuffed to the hospital bed, but, like I said before, the Bureau of Narcotics were in there. And you have Joseph McCarthy, who's, protected at the time. So that, for me, is just a really profound dichotomy in terms of, how history is played out around, all drugs, really, because, we're not talking about necessarily just marijuana here, but it certainly did start with marijuana. So the other thing about Harry Anslinger is, his domestic objective was basically to continue a form of substance prohibition, again, moving on from alcohol to marijuana, but he exports that war on drugs internationally across the globe. That's something that he basically sells to other countries. Now we have Richard Nixon. I'm gonna have to take a little drink before this one, sorry. I don't want to get into well, I guess I'm getting into politics. I'm not necessarily a supporter of Nixon, but I would say I do admire his just blatant, doing whatever he wants, sort of. To a certain extent, you sort of got to like politicians that just don't care. And I'm not a fan of Nixon, but I'm just saying, if you're going to give him anything. And so this is a quote from Nixon. I apologize for the language here, but this is Tricky Dick. I want a goddamn strong I'm not going to do a Nixon impression, sorry, but I want a goddamn strong statement on marijuana. I mean one on marijuana that just tears the ass out of them. By God, we are going to hit the marijuana thing. I want to hit it right square in the puss. I want to hit it against legalizing and all that sort of thing. So apparently Trump wasn't the first person to use that term. I won't say it again because it's a little derogative, but if I'm not mistaken, those are straight from the tapes, So the significance there in terms of Nixon is what we have is the passage of the Controlled Substance Act in 1970. So just to kind of go over the nature of the Substance Act. It's passed by Congress in 1970 and signed into law by President Nixon. So this is pretty significant, and most people in the room maybe are somewhat familiar with this. What happens at that point is cannabis gets classified as a Schedule I drug, which means it has high potential for abuse, according to the government. This prohibits it from being used medically, and it inhibits it from scientific, there being scientific research of the plant, essentially. For me, I work in academic scholarly publishing. For me, that's sort of the most profound thing because we have not had a lot of research related to cannabis. Some of you might know that, actually, I think Israel leads in research in relation, I'm seeing nods, heads nod. They're leading the way in terms of research in terms of across the globe, but unfortunately, since basically the Controlled Substance Act, but also throughout Prohibition, there's been sort of the medical society sort of staying away from researching the drug, and unfortunately, I think what that's kind of led to over time is, quite frankly, a lot of misinformation that's out there. There's a lot more we have to learn. We haven't learned, all of it yet for sure, but the reason why we haven't learned is, due to Prohibition, essentially. So Schedule I means that cannabis is the same class as heroin. I don't know if it's of interest to anyone, but cocaine's a Schedule II, so cocaine's below cannabis. Sorry, did you? All right. And we can get to questions at the end. The Controlled Substances Act leads to more and more criminalization of marijuana. And all of the data shows that African Americans and Latinos are jailed at a much higher rate due to all of this criminalization of marijuana. I don't have a book, and the exact data. There's a reason for that. It's true, folks. It's true. I don't want to have to point to specific things to sort of comment about sort of the disproportionate impact of the war on drugs, which Sue was referring to earlier. So why focus on marijuana? This kind of goes back to Nixon. And this has always fascinated me, even before cannabis, just throughout my intellectual understanding of the world in college and whatnot. And for me, prohibition is a political response to resistance movements. So you have the resistance to the Vietnam War at the time. And you have, you know, a lot of movements. I mean, you have Martin Luther King, and then you have Malcolm X, and then you have, you know, even the Black Panther movement that came out of that period. That on the bottom there is the Chicago 8. That's Bobby Seale. He's a Black Panther. That's Abby Hoffman, a well-known, you know, anti-war activist at the time. You know, for me, Nixon's decision is, you know, one that's very much political. The more that, you know, sort of the plant and marijuana is criminalized, the more that he can go after people for their politics. Because generally you know, at least for me, the way I kind of look at it, the people that tend to be sort of on the fringes of society or maybe kind of pushing back against the system a little bit, you do kind of maybe tend to see a little more cannabis use in those parts of society. So what gives rise to the legalization in the US? Okay, so this is a little bit of a theory of mine, but I think it is something that has been talked about a little bit. But in 2008, we have the financial crisis, right? So in 2008, there's a huge financial crisis. That's sort of the famous meeting where you have George W. Bush and Barack Obama and John McCain at the time, who were you know, candidates at the time. You got Lehman Brothers falling. You know, obviously, you know, we sort of have street protests and things of that nature. And for me, I think at the time there were governments were looking for more forms of revenue, basically. Here in Massachusetts, if I'm not mistaken, it was around when Deval Patrick, I mean, it might have been before that too, was trying to, you know, legalize gambling. Now we have a casino in Everett, right down from me where I live in Somerville. And so I think a lot of states were looking for perhaps an opportunity to collect more tax revenue. And so again, a little bit of a theory on my part, but it seemed to me that part of sort of the political wind sort of moving a little bit towards legalization did have some roots, I think, in the financial crisis of 2008. So in 2016, as a state, we passed what was question 4, which was the legalization of recreational marijuana. It's been since sort of moved to another term in terms of adult use marijuana, although people can use it sort of interchangeably. The vote was, I don't know if you can see it back there, but the vote was 53.6% yes, 46.4% no. Obviously the yeses had it, and that's for statewide. In Lancaster, you guys were really close. And I believe, and we can go into this if we need to in the question and answer, and I hope we do, because I have lots of information if you want to ask me about any of this. But to the best of my knowledge, you guys were a no. It looks like you were 49.9% yes and 50.1% no. I mean, that's really close. We got 1,976 yes votes and 1,987 no votes. I mean, neck and neck, really. So I'll just go over a little bit of sort of the legalization in Massachusetts here. Chapter 94G is something I know pretty well. That is the regulation use of distribution of marijuana not medically prescribed. That's essentially what question 4 was. You know, all of the folks that worked on that campaign put that law together, and then all of the citizens of Massachusetts or voters of Massachusetts, that's what they voted to pass. Now, there was also a rework. So after question 4 was passed in 2016, there was a rework, and that's actually when I testified in front of the Joint Committee on Marijuana Policy, in which what that actually turned into was what's referred to as Chapter 55 of the Acts of 2017. Just a reworking of language, basically. Now, what is also significant during that sort of period between the passage of question 4 and the Chapter 55 of the Acts of 2017 is what we had was a closed-door session in the State House. And part of the reason why I'm here is because of that closed-door session. In that closed-door session, 2 main things happened. And the vote was not a roll call vote, so you can't even see who, you know, essentially voted to make this happen. But 2 things happened. One, they pushed back the rollout, and I can't remember exact time period, but 1, they pushed back the rollout in terms of what the law had originally said. And 2, they basically said, I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's Chapter 40A, which has to do with agriculture, and this might be something that folks in the room are interested in. Essentially what it said was, right to farm included these plants, and then you had except for marijuana. And that was added in that closed door session right after the passage of question 4. Why that's significant to me, and again, I can go into this, believe me, as much as you possibly want during the Q&A. What that meant was then at that point, for any farmer to grow cannabis, you had to be zoned for cultivation in your individual municipality. So in Lancaster here, a farmer can't simply grow cannabis as their right to farm. They have to make sure that they're zoned properly by your local laws. That has been the biggest struggle for our organization, has been essentially getting farmers and growers zoned for cultivation. One of the biggest struggles that I've had, throughout my advocacy process is everything's, as far as cultivation, is being zoned in commercial industrial districts. There's a number of different reasons for that. One, the medical industry, that was essentially how the medical marijuana industry was brought into place in Massachusetts here, it was seen as essentially an industrialized process. Also, by state law, in terms on the medical side, all of the companies that came about, by law, had to be vertically integrated. And they also basically had to prove that they had millions in the bank to get into the industry. If I'm not mistaken, it was also $30,000 even to apply for a license if you were going to be a medical operator. So that's not a great environment for small business, basically. And I knew that when we passed question 4 and we were sort of transitioning from medical to adult use, I knew that it was going to be quite a process of getting folks to understand the plant a little bit differently in terms of this sort of industrialized scenario, which is an indoor growing scenario, to opening it up to our farmers. But I gotta admit, I didn't think it was going to be as hard as it currently is. And again, I can go into this a little more in the QA if possible. But that is definitely the biggest challenge that we have now. And there's a lot of nervousness, quite frankly, to folks envisioning cannabis being grown more like a plant and less like a controlled substance. I do a lot of advocacy across the state. People want to sort of maybe out of sight, out of mind. There's a little bit of that mentality, but make sure that it's essentially under lock and key, indoors, and in basically industrialized facility. I have no problem with the plant being grown in that way, but at the end of the day, I think that business has a right to basically sort of exist how it wants to exist. And I think that, unfortunately, if we're only going to do indoor growing, that's a lot of electricity. That's a lot of, not very environmentally conscious growing that's going on. So that's definitely currently, the struggle that we're involved in now as an organization. So the Massachusetts regulation, 935 CMR 500, adult use marijuana. If I'm not mistaken, yeah, I think that's the date that was finalized by the Cannabis Control Commission, March 23rd, 2018. So that's when the final regs came out. The draft regs came out in December, right before Christmas. In 2017, and then the final regs were in 2018. I think the Cannabis Control Commission, for me personally, did a very good job. They did a lot of touring throughout the state to listen to folks. They did it before the draft regulations. They did it after the draft regulations. So there was plenty of opportunity to go out and speak to the Cannabis Control Commission. Again, just my opinion, but I really think the commission did a great job with it to actually listen to the people of Massachusetts in terms of what they really wanted out of the industry. I don't think we necessarily had that transparency in the medical program that was instated earlier. Honestly, my state senator, who's Patricia Jalen, sat on the Joint Committee for Marijuana Policy, and even she is pretty open about the fact that we have much more transparency as far as adult use than we saw in medical. Again, just from a regulatory and basically governmental standpoint. So I'm going to go in just like a little bit here about, sort of our organization and kind of where I fit in, just because I thought it would be helpful to the group. So I did a ton of advocacy around cooperatives. The way that I kind of tell the story, I don't know if this is helpful to the group, but I'm going to tell it anyway. I was, in cannabis, it's kind of the only, I often say, it's the only industry that you start having a business conversation with your state senator, basically. And so after Question 4 was passed, I was very passionate about cannabis. I was very passionate about the passage of Question 4. I didn't work on the Question 4 campaign, but became very politically active after the passage of Question 4. And my biggest concern with the law as I read it was that we were still at risk of basically an out-of-state takeover of large corporations sort of coming in. And I was exchanging emails with Senator Jalen's staff, again, because she was on the Joint Committee on Marijuana Policy, also happened to be my senator. And at one point, Senator Jalen actually responded to me directly and said, if you have any ideas around around cooperatives, I'm all ears. And at that point, I just started researching co-ops, started understanding the model a little bit more, talked to my friend that's actually works at Farm Aid. I don't know if folks are familiar with Farm Aid. They help small farmers across the country. They're a national nonprofit. One of her friends at Farm Aid was very sort of knowledgeable on the topics of cooperatives, started talking to her a little bit. And what I later found out, and it's kind of weird because a lot of us advocates were sort of working in parallel, but what I later found out was the idea supposedly came from Senator Sears' office. Senator Sear is senator in the Cape and Islands area, and supposedly the idea came around the idea of the shellfish cooperatives that exist out there. Might have to ask Senator Sear a little more about that, but that's at least my understanding in terms of how this has played out and what I sort of learned throughout the process of my advocacy. But getting back to it, within the regulations, again, 935 CMR 500, a marijuana cultivator, craft marijuana cooperative is defined as a marijuana cultivator comprised of residents of the Commonwealth and organized as a limited liability partnership or cooperative corporation under the laws of the Commonwealth. A cooperative is licensed to cultivate, obtain, manufacture, process, package, and brand cannabis or marijuana products, to transport marijuana to marijuana establishments, but not to consumers. I don't know if you want me to go into it too much, but basically our cooperative is comprised of different cultivators in different municipalities. You can have up to what's called canopy space. You can have up to 1,000 square foot of growing canopy space among the entire cooperative of growers, basically, and up to 3 manufacturing locations under 1 license. That doesn't mean that one grower is growing up to 100,000 square foot of canopy. It means that you can have multiple growers that equal that, essentially. If you don't know what canopy space is, this is a garden club. It's basically green space of the flowering plant. So when you have cannabis kind of grow up like this, that measurement of the top is how the industry does it as far as canopy space. So in the state regs, this is something that I advocated extremely hard for. So the initial draft regulations that came out from the CCC did not define what a cooperative was. I had great anxiety that not defining a cooperative in the regulations meant sort of any corporation could come in, call themselves a co-op, and get up and started, but they're not actually a co-op. It's interesting, cooperatives is sort of like this old idea, but it's throughout my advocacy also a very new idea. You say co-ops, people generally, at least from my experience, they might know the word, but don't really understand what a cooperative is and sort of what that structure is. So when those draft regs came out, I advocated that there was more definition put into the regulations. And what eventually happened, throughout advocacy, not only by myself, but a lot of different other folks, was that they did put that definition within the final regulations when they came out in March. So the craft marijuana cooperative must operate consistently with the 7 principles established by the International Cooperative Alliance in 1995. Just a little tidbit, I was emailing the CCC on Christmas night, basically, being like, what the hell did you do? Why aren't you defining what a cooperative is here? And so just going into it a little bit about our organization, I see us as a craft marijuana cultivator cooperative founded on the 7 principles of a co-op. I'll go over there a little bit, quickly in terms of defining those 7 principles. Voluntary open membership, so anyone can join regardless of race, creed, sex. It's democratic member control, so you have 1 member, 1 vote, basically. Members' economic participation. A couple things on that. Generally, co-ops are formed where each folks come in with their own sort of economic contribution, if you will. But there's also usually a system of profit sharing within that co-op. A co-op is autonomous and independent. Kind of love this one because basically what that means is that co-op is formed under specific bylaws that are being ratified by that cooperative, and that's autonomous of the government or any sort of corporation. They're defining their own destiny, so to speak. 5, education and training and information. So I sort of maybe partly why I'm here. I think that that's a very good principle of a co-op is to sort of continually educate and train. But I think within the cooperative itself, it's also important for cooperative members to be educating each other. Cooperatives among co-ops. So this one that is one that could be quite interesting that plays out in the cannabis industry. By the 7 principles, we got to be working with other co-ops. There's actually another co-op out in Cannabis Co-op out in Truro, Massachusetts. I communicate, now and again with, one of their, folks in the organization there, and I even said recently on the phone call with him, hey, we're both co-ops. By the 7 principles, we have to be working with each other. And concern for community. For me, I really like this one because, again, those are in the state regulations that you have to have concern for your community. I think that co-ops should be part of the community. I think that the cannabis industry is going to be, predicted to be a $1 billion industry by 2020 in Massachusetts alone. It's exciting because it's a new industry. It's also a little scary when you sort of have that kind of, money sort of involved in an industry. And I think that it's important for the businesses that are, establishing here in Massachusetts that they have really a relationship with the communities that they're in. So I really, kind of like that principle. So our mission, this is sort of changing, here or there. That's sort of part of being an entrepreneur that I've found is constantly adapting. I think ultimately we'll probably vote on what our final mission statement is, but for now, Farm Bud Cooperative is a producer-owned co-op made up of local farmers and craft growers delivering the highest quality artisanal cannabis to the state of Massachusetts, to the Massachusetts market. We are uniquely focused on clean, organic, and sustainable cultivation methods. Farm Bud Co-op is working to better local communities through cannabis education and local advocacy. Again, hopefully I'm living up to that mission right now, to educating you fine folks here. Okay, so we'll get into the grower portion now. And again, if I may, I'm a home grower, only been growing for about a year or so now. So if I'm not as in depth about the cultivation side of it, hopefully we can come back here and get a little more in depth. But this is sort of like this second half is kind of like a snapshot of growing, so to speak. This is a picture I actually took today. That's in my laundry room. That is 2 tents, 2x4, 2x4. The one in the back there is my veg tent. The one in the front there is my flowering tent. You got some ventilation there that's heading out through my basement outdoors. For the record, never had any problem with smell whatsoever. No problem with smell. It goes right through what's called a carbon filter. And I live in Somerville, really densely populated there, and that shoots out where my, you can see the laundry there, it shoots out where the, whatever it is, the dryer vent or whatever, right? Never once had any issue with anyone, any sort of smell. Throughout Massachusetts, people are really nervous about smell, at least from my experience advocating. I know this is a smaller scale, but I'm just letting you know that there's been no complaints as far as the plants being emitted outside. I will say there is a bit of a smell kind of like in the tents themselves, obviously. It's a plant. It does have a little bit of an organic smell to it. This is one now that's in veg for me. I'll go into it a little bit more, but the method that I do a raised bed method that I've kind of learned through cultivators. That's kind of hay on the top there. The idea in the hay is so that the lights coming down don't affect the soil underneath, and folks here might be kind of familiar with those methods in the garden club. And I'll go into a little bit more, but the method that I've learned from a lot of growers that are working with us is what's called a no-till method. That's essentially what's called a living soil. A living soil, and I can go into a little bit more, but basically what a living soil is something that exists that builds in all of the nutrients essentially that the plant needs. The way that you build a living soil is through a process called cooking it. So you put all the amendments in and you water it and you basically cook it for the longer the better. And that develops these what sort of organisms and what some people refer to as microbeasties sort of in the soil itself, and it has this everything essentially for the plant is in the soil itself, so that you're not adding a lot of fertilizers to it. That's generally the idea. I can go to a little bit later into the definition of a no-till, but to give you kind of a quick glimpse. That here is actually, I think it was 1 or 2 weeks ago, that's in my flower tent. I have a indica dominant Afghani going right now that I'm kind of more of a sativa guy, but I'm looking very forward to having a landrace indica that I got from an individual who will remain nameless at the moment. But anyway, that's kind of generally my grow setup. This is a picture of Massachusetts outdoor. So I mean, I think the main thing that I want to convey here is, yes, cannabis can be grown in outdoors in Massachusetts. This is in the hills of Massachusetts right here. And something maybe to go a little back to the politics on it, one of the things that I've been trying to get local governments to understand is the harder that you make it for individuals to grow cannabis sort of where they want to grow cannabis means that the illicit market is going to stay alive and well. Cannabis has been growing in Massachusetts for years and years and years. Outdoors, it's something that has obviously been underground, part of the illicit market, if you will. And sort of the harder that you make it for individuals to get into the industry, we're going to see an illicit market that stays competitive, prices stay low, and be extremely competitive with the legal market for the foreseeable future. So when I really try to educate folks, on the municipal end in terms of governments, it's around that idea of like the harder that you make it for our local cultivators, our local farmers, our local growers to get into the industry, you're going to have an illicit market that remains around for a long time. How long, I don't know. We'll see kind of how it plays out. Okay, so we have the species here. The sativa, as you can, and I think this might even been on the pamphlet for the evening tonight. Sativa the leaves are a little thinner. Indica leaves are a little fatter. Ruderalis is kind of like the smaller version of the plant. So I guess just a quick overview. Sativa generally grown in tropical regions. Indica is a little more native, to the best of my knowledge, Europe, so it has a little bit more of genetics that sort of coincide with our climate a little bit. Ruderalis, from my understanding, can grow anywhere. Excuse my French there, sorry. I think I said I wasn't going to swear, but Ruderalis, the reason why a lot of people don't use Ruderalis, though, is low yield on Ruderalis. Generally, you see higher yields from indicas and hybrids. You can get good yields out of sativas, but they also grow higher. So depending on kind of how you're growing the plant, that can be like a little bit tougher if you're doing it indoors or what have you. But so a lot of folks that grow indoor that have a smaller amount of space, you generally, might go to an indica. Again, just for space-wise. But yeah, ruderalis is an interesting one. I don't know, this is totally speculation on my part. I don't know if this is gonna come back into being a little more. It yields less, but it works, my understanding, works very well in colder environments. So I don't know, perhaps in Massachusetts, if we'll start seeing ruderalis. I know one grower in particular where I learned some of my growing from, I don't know, a year plus so ago or whatever, was very big on ruderalis, just loved the ruderalis species.
Too, is that
Oh yeah, go ahead.
ruderalis, one of the things that makes it useful is that it's an auto flower. So in a regular grow cycle, you have the vegetation cycle where you have to have light longer than 12 hours, and then your flowering cycle is when you switch from 12 of light and 12 of dark. Cannabis ruderalis doesn't need that change in lighting. It will grow vegetative as long as it can, and then it will just automatically start flowering. So in a situation like Massachusetts, where there isn't essentially a very long growing season, and this is something that we've talked about, where if you want to actually have a successful outdoor grow, you need to start your plants earlier, and you also need to use some supplemental lighting indoors. Ruderalis is beneficial because it doesn't need that. It can grow in a shorter cycle, and so for a Massachusetts summer, which isn't quite as long as, say, a summer in Mexico or somewhere where indica or sativa is used to, ruderalis can be incredibly beneficial.
Thanks, Sean. And that brings up something that was came to mind as you were saying that too. Is a lot of the discussions that come up here in Massachusetts is the environment here basically, because cannabis obviously known sort of for being grown out in California. I mean, the cannabis that's grown out there has been feeding the states and even honestly internationally for years and years and years. They had a medical program out there, but not only that, the environment is a little more less like the New England environment, so to speak. So we do have obviously a smaller growing season here. Now that's not to say that you can't use the sun. You can absolutely use the sun in a greenhouse environment to sort of cut back on that electricity. But yes, you have a shorter growth cycle in which if you want to go year round, within a greenhouse, you likely will have to do some supplementation to sort of make up for that, again, just shorter growing season in a relation to the light cycles being a bit different here in Massachusetts, but also not just the light cycles, but obviously the environment, the fact that it's really cold. Cannabis grows best in about 70 degrees Fahrenheit, that kind of thing. So you're going to need to have some sort of controlled environment in that greenhouse, obviously for the winter periods and non-growing seasons. So I don't know if you can't see all of it from there, but this is kind of just like a brief breakdown here. You got a little bit of the psychotropic effects, but also how it's grown. You got sativa on the left, indica on the right. I don't know if you can see it too much, but as I said, the sativa grows much higher. The indica is kind of like bulkier, bushier. And as far as the psychotropic effects, the sativas are known for what people call, who are consumers, the head high, and the indica is known more for a body high, so like a little more relaxing. So indicas generally can maybe be a little better for pain or for sleep or that sort of thing, where sativas are maybe a little buzzier, if you will. But the interesting thing for me also is generally everything's a hybrid, to be quite honest, because the plants have been mixed so much over time and time that really anything that you're smoking is a hybrid. It might be more of a sativa dominant or an indica dominant, but generally everything's kind of hybrid these days, again, just because of the the mixing of the plants. Yeah, generally the more sativa dominant are higher in THC, and that's why it gives you that head high that people refer to. Yeah, because the higher sort of on the THC side is more of, again, the head high, if you will.
Keep in mind, like you said, these are hybrids. There are now lots of genomics places out in California and Colorado that are doing specific research into actually looking at the transcript of DNA, because it's not just THC or CBD. There's also terpenes and lots of other cannabinoids that will affect what you experience. Right now, we're going with these because these are what people have learned through the periods of prohibition about what these strains in general, what the experience is like. But as we get more research and as we get more companies that are going to be able to actually spend some time in the labs with the plants, doing the reactions, doing the testing, we'll be able to actually have some sort of profile where you can look and say, okay, here's the strain. I know this strain is specifically going to be good for me to help me go to sleep, or this is something that I want before I go for a run or before I go play soccer.
Right.
And that's, again, something that the prohibition has just totally stagnated development in what's something that we should have a lot of knowledge about.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And you know, particularly in relation to genetics, and like Sean said, how those genetics, you know, affect you medicinally, basically. And I think and just to throw out there real quick, one thing that comes to mind is just from a regulatory standpoint, Massachusetts has a research license as well. So, you know, us in sort of, you know, advocacy and getting into the business, you know, we're pretty hopeful, hopefully here, that, you know, Massachusetts, with all the universities and the research that's done here, maybe hopefully we can be the hub of research for cannabis in the States. If I'm not mistaken, we're the first state to actually have a research license. I think it's pretty significant. You know, just being in the industry, I don't know if I know officially of someone sort of, at least that I know personally, like going after that sort of thing. Well, you know, we'll see how it plays out. But again, I think it's very significant that we have that, very good that we have that here. All right, so grow medium. So again, the no-till method, not necessarily an expert, but it's what I've learned from the cultivators that I've been, you know, in touch with for a while now. It can be done indoor or outdoor, obviously. You know, makes a little more sense outdoor, but those are my indoor plants here on the right. That's my veg tent. And I'm just going to give you kind of just a very general description of no-till. No-till farming, also called zero tillage or direct drilling, is a way of growing crops or pasture from year to year without disturbing the soil through tillage. No-till is an agricultural technique which increases the amount of water that infiltrates into the soil, the soil's retention of organic matter, and its cycling nutrients. So what I've also done with my plants is introduce worms in terms of colonies of worms within the no-till. I will admit, I can't pay, you know, for a lot of electric bills and a lot of, you know, I got the side hustle entrepreneur, I got 2 kids, you know. I don't quite have the environment controlled as best as I'd like to. So it is in my basement. It's not heated right now. It's definitely a lower temperature. I definitely would get a much higher, better yield if I had, you know, sort of that 70 degrees or so. So I fully admit I don't have the best situation right now. Who knows, if I have a little more cash, you know, and whatnot, I can make it a little better in the future. But you want it to be, you know, generally, you know, not humid, you know, kind of ideally just, you know, sort of 50% in terms of humidity. Again, kind of around 70 degrees or so. Oh, I can just throw out some brief things too. Generally, you want, you know, pH about 7 on the water. I don't know if there's anything else I can kind of pass in at this point. I'll keep going, but this could come up in the question and answer as far as some of the other cultivation stuff. But yeah, generally, the great thing that I've found with the no-till, you don't have to do a lot of watering. And in particular, I'm not against hydro, but if you're going to grow hydro, you're pumping in nutrients. That's how you do it with hydro grows. When I say hydro means that you're only growing the plant in water and just adding nutrients to those water. Basically, I've never grown that way personally. You know, again, nothing against it. It's not the way I learned.
For example, in terms of nutrients, like if you're going to do hydroponic grows, you're going to need to add calcium. Calcium is always important. And so you could either buy a bottle of calcium supplement, pour it into your water, or you can create a living soil. You can buy locally sourced shells. Calcium carbonate is a major component of seashells. And so if you source seashells, say from Cape Cod, you can bring those seashells in, crush them up, and put them into the mix. And as long as you have a well-established microbiome, first, that calcium carbonate has to be broken down into just the ion calcium, but once you have that microbiome set up, you don't need to constantly add nutrients, and you don't need to constantly check to make sure that you have the right nutrient schedule and nutrient setup, because the soil will regulate itself.
Yeah, and that's part of what I was referring to as the living soil, is basically adding those amendments, and like I said before, cooking it over time so that you're introducing all of those nutrients into the soil. All right, so male versus female, this is one that Sue was happy about because as I understand, I mean, you can explain it maybe, Sue, but as I understand it, she had some trouble with some. So yeah, if you are growing for flower, you want just females. You can have females next to males, but you're gonna get seedy bud, basically. Now, I get a lot of clones, quite honestly, so I think I've yet to grow from seed. Again, I know that's probably kind of pathetic, but again, you know, I'm not one of our professional cultivators that we're working with, still a home grower, but also having access to cultivators, it's great getting clones all the time. But if you're growing from seed, what happens is, I think about like probably, you know, 3 nodes up or so, like, you know, when the plant kind of, I don't know, maybe that high or so, something like that. What you'll see form are, on the males, it'll be like you know, like a round nodule, if you will. And on the females, there'll be a bit of a nodule, but what will grow out of that is, I don't know, how can I describe it? Like a, yeah, right, the pistil up here. You can see it pretty well here in terms of that right there. That's kind of a good picture. I don't know if you can see it too well in the back, but that's a really good picture of what a female looks like with those pistils popping out there. And that's you know, that's a male bud. So, you know, if you're growing for flower, again, you got to pull those males and just go with the females. Oh, and there's also hermaphrodites too, which are a combination of both. Okay, so light cycles, they're sometimes you can do, if you want, some people do 24-hour light cycles, or sorry, let me start again. You have vegetative and flowering. Okay, so the idea is that the plant grows vegetatively, and then as the season changes, that plant is going to want to pollinate, and it starts flowering before it thinks it's going to die, basically. That's essentially what happens. And this is kind of looking at it maybe from an indoor perspective, but basically, you know, in my veg, you have 6 hours in terms of the light-dark cycle. And then you move that into a 12-12 as far as light-dark. So, you know, what that basically is doing, you know, at least in an indoor environment, is you know, sort of recreating what's actually happening in nature. Again, as far as the plant grows, the plant thinks it's going to die, and the plant is flowering to pollinate. That's in that 12 to 12 cycle, which here in Massachusetts, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Sean, but we're talking late summer, fall, basically, in terms of when we.
If you start a little late, you're going to get your bud flowering basically sort of past the optimal time. And it might start flowering when it's 70, but it's going to take a little while longer for the full bud to develop. And if it starts to get cold, you have to deal with bud rot. You have to deal with lots of infestations.
Good point, right.
And it just makes it really, really difficult.
Yeah, good point. One of the challenges here for growers definitely is humidity. So in Massachusetts, we generally, you know, have a more humid climate than out in, like, say, California, which is obviously a more drier climate out west there. So bud rot is something very real here in Massachusetts, something that growers talk about a lot. You know, obviously that's if you're indoors, that can be controlled a little bit more. But I mean, even in greenhouses, you have more of a, you know, controlled environment. If you're full on outdoor, you're going to be obviously then a little more at risk for bud rot. But definitely the humidity is a big challenge, particularly for Massachusetts growers, you know, due to the environment. All right, so I thought I'd give you kind of a general idea of at least me as a home grower. Again, this is, you know, not, you know, we can sort of talk growing, you know, we could talk, you know, days about this basically, but I thought I'd give you kind of just a glimpse of kind of like, you know, sort of how I do it here. So I have my veg tent, my flowering tent, and I don't actually have a drying tent. I use my flowering tent to dry. What I have had to do, the other thing important to know is every strain is different in terms of when it's ready and matured. So I can actually, it's just a space issue, but I can only have one strain in my flowering tent at a time because that one strain, when it's matured, I pull it, but then I also have to dry it in that tent also. And so I need to have the environment, pretty well to dry the cannabis as well. So what that essentially means is, again, I'm only limited to one strain. So what I'm doing is I'm vegging in my veg tent. I move, the cannabis into the flower tent, buds, pull it. I've actually been trimming wet recently, and I can explain that in a little bit. Trim it, dry it for about, it's usually around a week or so to dry, and you do a snap test for dry. So what that means is you bend the branch. If the branch is still sort of bending but not snapping, it's not ready yet. But if you bend it, snaps, that's usually when it's good to go. And so the trichomes are the oils on the plant itself, and that's essentially what gives the plants its effects, its medicinal effects, if you will. If you see here, that's kind of like pulled back a little bit of the bud, but if you actually go down individually into the plant, that's what they look like with that sort of little ball on the top, if you will. This is actually, you can't see it too well from here, but that's actually my last run. That was sour diesel. And what you actually do is kind of get like a little microscope. And it's really interesting to see. When you get under that microscope, you're essentially seeing this here as far as the trichomes. And as I said, every strain is different, and cultivators can be a little different too, but you're generally waiting until those trichomes have matured, in which they're cloudy and maybe are getting a little bit of amber. If you get too much amber, you're going to get bud that just puts you to sleep and is not, you've basically waited too long and pulled it a little late there. Again, it does sort of depend on the grower. It also depends on sort of the medicinal effects that you're going for. So if you are going for more of a sleep effect, maybe you'll wait for it to be a little more amber, basically. So it, again, kind of depends. It definitely depends on the strain. Depends on the cultivator a little bit, depends on, sort of what effects you're going for. For me personally, when it's starting to be amber, that's usually when I'm ready to pull that. This is, not really sure what that is on the left, I don't know where it is, but that's cannabis being dried. That's my tent there on the left. You go upside down, hang the plant upside down. Like I said, it usually takes about a week or so, 7 to 10 days. But again, that snap test is generally how growers do it traditionally. And so when I was saying before, as far as trimming, and I'll show trimming a little bit next, is what I've done recently to get a better trim is, you can do it either way. Again, kind of depends on the grower, but what I've done is, after I see the trichomes are ready, pull the plant, then trim it. So trimming wet means you've just pulled it, basically, and then hang it to dry. And then after that, I do a nice kind of, little trim off again after that, and then it goes in a cure, and I can explain that a little bit later. So a wet trim means that you've done it just when you pulled it. Learn all this stuff from growers. It's, text messages and whatnot that come my way. But what I had sort of originally done first was dry it first and then trim it. I found that I get a little bit better trim if I do a wet trim. Again, it's sort of dependent on the cultivator, what you sort of prefer, what sort of final product you want. But I have found it to be a little more effective to do that wet trim. This is all pictures from my basement, basically. That's the cannabis here. A little too leggy. I'm still working on getting a little bulkier, a little less leggy. If I'm not mistaken, this was me trimming wet there in terms of what that, you probably can't see it too well, but, and this is just kind of the aftermath. I mean, I think that it's universally, shared by every cannabis grower that trimming is sort of the worst part about growing the plant. Although I do know a very good grower who is also a great advocate and hairdresser, and she sort of likes trimming. For me, it's fun. I mean, every grower sort of says the same thing. It's fun for like the first, I don't know, half hour, and then after that, you're like, Jesus, all right, Yeah, and you might want to wear gloves too. It's a very sticky process. So yeah, you can do gloves. You can also get a lot of res out of it. If you during the process and scrape off the res if you really want to do that. I generally just like throw all the way. But you can also turn trim into some folks turn it into edibles. It's going to have, sort of a little less, obviously the majority of the medicinal effects and THC and all that is going to be in the bud itself, but there still are, the same sort of compounds that are in that trim as well. And generally what, growers and folks, in the industry do is, what you do is you turn your trim into something else. So usually it's, into a distillate or an edible or something of that sort. You're really trying to use the whole plant during the process, ideally in a sustainable way. Quite honestly, you can put that right back into the soil. Cannabis loves cannabis, basically. And so curing, I got a jar here. I'm not gonna lie to you, I'm still working on my curing. Generally in a jar, and you do what's called burping. Burping is you just open it up, usually on a daily basis, give it get the oxygen in there, give it a nice go. You do want it in a dry environment, in your house, you don't want it in the basement, you want it like upstairs, something like that. It's generally by preference in terms of, how long it takes to cure. Again, kind of depends on the grower, depends on the strain, depends on how you really want to do it. It's a process that can take anywhere between a month, 3 months, again, kind of really dependent on. There definitely are also, as the industry is emerging, there's, tons and tons of new technologies that are coming about for the curing process and all that, speeding it up, getting a better cure. There's a lot of stuff that I hear about. I'm sure there's a lot of companies that we'll be working with, in the future that are, working on both getting a better cure, but getting it faster, taking it to market faster. There's, a million ideas that are out there and a million companies that they call it ancillary businesses that will emerge up, around this industry.